When you hear the word demon, what do you truly see? When you hear the term fallen angel, do you picture the same entity? For centuries, popular theology and a deeply ingrained cultural tradition have masterfully blended these two profoundly different concepts into a single, monolithic, and ultimately misleading image of the enemy. We have been taught to see the forces of darkness as a unified, homogeneous army, a singular entity of evil, often simply and vaguely labeled Satan and his demons, as if they were all cut from the same celestial cloth. But what if this blurred and simplified picture is not an accident of history? What if this confusion is not a harmless semantic oversight, but the result of a deliberate and ancient act of censorship? What if it is a theological redaction that has effectively erased the enemy's organizational chart, his chain of command, and his entire order of battle from our strategic manuals? The truth, as preserved in the most ancient and uncensored texts of our faith, paints a far more complex, far more nuanced, and strategically vital picture. These texts do not describe a single unified army of darkness. They describe at least two distinct classes of hostile, supernatural entities. They describe two separate armies with fundamentally different origins, different natures, different limitations, and different battlefield functions, all fighting in the same cosmic war. To not know the difference between these two forces is as dangerous as a soldier on a modern battlefield being unable to distinguish between a strategic bomber flying at 30,000 feet and a guerrilla fighter hiding in a trench. Today, we unblur the picture. We open the classified dossier on the true hierarchy of hell, and we expose the hidden truth of the two armies that have been waging war against humanity since before the time of Adam. To understand the hierarchy of hell, we must first travel back to a time before time, to a conflict that took place not on the soil of earth, but in the unimaginable splendor of the heavenly realms, long before Adam was ever formed from dust. This is the story of the first and most foundational rebellion. This is the origin of the beings we correctly call fallen angels. The sacred texts, particularly the prophetic books of Isaiah and Ezekiel, give us cryptic but powerful glimpses into this primordial event. They speak of a celestial being of immense beauty, wisdom, and rank. Isaiah calls him Helel ben Shahar, the Shining One, Son of the Dawn, a name later translated into Latin as Lucifer. He was not a minor functionary. He was an anointed cherub, a guardian of the very throne of God, adorned with every precious stone, perfect in his ways from the day he was created. But his perfection was corrupted by the most ancient and potent of all spiritual poisons, pride. He looked upon his own beauty, his own wisdom, his own exalted position, and he was no longer content to be a reflector of God's glory. He desired to be a source of his own. The prophet Isaiah records the 5 blasphemous "I will" statements that formed the core of his rebellion. I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the Mount of Assembly. I will make myself like the Most High. This was not a sin of the flesh. It was a sin of the will. It was an act of high treason in the celestial court, a political and cosmic coup attempt, and he was not alone. The Book of Revelation tells us that his tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. This is a symbolic depiction of a massive civil war in heaven, where Lucifer convinced a vast legion of other angels to join him in his rebellion. The result was not a prolonged war, but a swift and decisive judgment. They were cast out of the highest heaven, stripped of their glory, and became the first fallen angels. It is critical to understand their nature. They are primordial, purely spiritual beings. Their crime was political and theological. Their motive was pride, and their sphere of operation, their battleground, is the high places, the heavenly realms, from which they seek to influence the governments and power structures of the universe. They are the officer class, the strategic command, the ancient and aristocratic generals of the kingdom of darkness. But they are not the only army in the field. Thousands of years after the first primordial rebellion had scarred the heavens, a second, and in some ways more insidious, mutiny took place. This was not a war for the throne of God, but a war for the soul of humanity. This is the forbidden history of the Watchers, a story whose suppression has been central to the blurring of our understanding of the enemy. As we have detailed in our previous investigations, the ancient chronicles of Enoch and Jubilees attest that in the early days of humanity, God dispatched an elite class of 200 angels to the earth. Their sacred mission was to watch over, guard, and instruct the fledgling human race. They were a celestial garrison, a divine peacekeeping force tasked with maintaining the sacred order of the new world. But their guardianship curdled into a different kind of desire. This was not the same prideful theological rebellion of Lucifer. This was a rebellion born of lust and a desire for a different kind of power. It was the sin of admixture. The Watchers, led by their chief, Samyaza, conspired together on Mount Hermon. They bound themselves by a terrible oath to abandon their heavenly station, to descend to the earthly plane, and to commit a profound act of cosmic treason, to take human wives and to illegally mingle their spiritual, angelic nature with the physical, terrestrial nature of humanity. This second mutiny was fundamentally different from the first. The first was a vertical rebellion, an attempt to ascend and seize a higher throne. The second was a horizontal rebellion, a desire to descend and possess a lower creation. The crime of Lucifer was metaphysical pride. The crime of the Watchers was a grotesque and forbidden form of physical desire. While they are also fallen angels in the sense that they fell from a state of grace, their sin, their motive, and their ultimate fate are distinct from those of the first rebellion. They are a different class of traitor, a different division in the army of darkness, whose crime was not against the throne of God, but directly against the sanctity and the genetic integrity of the human race. And the consequences of their specific crime would produce an entirely new and terrifying class of enemy. The catastrophic result of this second mutiny, this forbidden fusion of the celestial and the terrestrial, was the birth of a new and monstrous race, the Nephilim. As we have seen, these were not just giant humans. They were violent, bloodthirsty hybrids, beings of immense power and insatiable appetites who filled the earth with a level of violence and corruption so profound that it necessitated a global flood. But the story of the Nephilim does not end with their physical death in the waters of judgment. In fact, their death is the beginning of another, even more insidious story. It is the origin story of the beings we now call demons. The ancient texts of Enoch and Jubilees are explicit and unwavering on this point, providing a clear and terrifying answer to a question that the canonical Bible leaves a mystery. What happened to the spirits of the giants after their physical bodies were destroyed? They were a hybrid creation, an unholy mixture of a spiritual, angelic father and a physical, human mother. Because of their supernatural paternal origin, their spirits could not simply cease to exist like the spirit of an animal. But because of their corrupted terrestrial maternal origin and their own monstrous sins, they could not ascend to the heavenly realms. They were trapped. Their disembodied spirits were condemned to remain on the earth, stripped of the physical bodies they once possessed, but still filled with the same supernatural power and the same malevolent predatory nature. These, the ancient texts declare, are the demons. This is a revelation of staggering importance. It shatters the simplistic idea that demons are just another word for fallen angels. They are not. According to this uncensored history, they are an entirely different class of being. They are not the primordial, purely spiritual entities who rebelled with Lucifer. They are the tormented, disembodied, and vengeful ghosts of the dead giants. Their origin is not in the celestial courts of heaven, but in the blood-soaked soil of a corrupted earth. And this specific origin explains their unique and terrifying motivation, a motivation that is fundamentally different from that of their fallen angelic masters. With this forbidden knowledge of origins now firmly established, we can, for the first time, construct an accurate organizational chart of the enemy's forces. This is not just an academic exercise, it is a critical piece of strategic intelligence. The kingdom of darkness is not a disorganized mob of chaotic evil, but a structured and highly stratified military hierarchy with at least two distinct and primary divisions. We can think of them as the command structure and the infantry. To fail to understand the profound difference between these two is to be strategically blind on the spiritual battlefield. First, there are the fallen angels. These are the primordial, purely spiritual beings who participated in the first two great mutinies, the original cosmic rebellion of Lucifer in the age before Adam and the subsequent terrestrial mutiny of the Watchers. These entities are the officer class, the high command of the kingdom of darkness. Their origin is celestial. They were created in the heavenly realms and once held positions of honor and authority. Their nature is purely spiritual. They are not, and have never been, human. Their primary sin was one of pride, of a political and theological rebellion against the very throne of God. Their primary theater of operations is, as the Apostle Paul describes it, in the heavenly realms. They are the principalities, the powers, the cosmic rulers over this present darkness. They are the strategists, the ideologues, the architects of the grand, centuries-long campaigns against God's redemptive plan. They are the ones who whisper in the ears of kings, who shape the course of empires, and who construct the great philosophical lies that deceive entire generations. And then there are the demons. These are the disembodied spirits of the dead Nephilim. They are the spiritual infantry, the ground troops, the tormented and terrifying foot soldiers of the kingdom of darkness. Their origin is not celestial, but terrestrial. They were born on earth from the illegal and monstrous admixture of angelic and human nature. Their nature is not purely spiritual, but hybrid, a twisted and tormented echo of their former semi-physical existence. Their primary sin was not political rebellion in the high heavens, but brute physical violence, consumption, and destruction on the earth. Their primary theater of operations is, therefore, exclusively the earthly realm. They are not the cosmic rulers, they are the street-level thugs, the tormentors, the agents of affliction, disease, madness, and possession. A fallen angel is a traitor to a heavenly government. A demon is the vengeful, disembodied ghost of a monstrous hybrid terrorist. One is a general planning a global campaign from a hidden strategic headquarters. The other is a guerrilla fighter, an insurgent, planting bombs and terrorizing civilians on the ground. They are not the same. And this distinction is absolutely critical to understanding the different ways in which the forces of darkness interact with our world. The most compelling piece of evidence that God and the heavenly court recognize this profound distinction between fallen angels and demons is found in the story of the post-flood bargain, the chilling legal negotiation that we have previously examined from the Book of Jubilees. This event is not just a story about the origin of evil's power. It is a legal proceeding that explicitly differentiates between the two classes of rebellious entities and assigns them two very different fates. Let us revisit the scene. The great flood has cleansed the earth. The physical bodies of the Nephilim have been destroyed, but their disembodied spirits, the demons, begin to plague the new world. Noah prays for their removal. In response, God issues a dual decree. The first part of that decree concerns the angelic fathers, the watchers who had initiated this entire catastrophe. Their sentence, as we know from the Book of Enoch, was immediate and absolute. They were to be bound in chains and cast into the abyss, into a celestial prison, to be held there until the final judgment. They were taken off the battlefield completely. But the second part of the decree concerning the demonic spirits of their offspring was different. This is the moment that Mastema, their prince, steps forward to make his legal appeal. He does not ask for the watchers to be released. He knows that their sentence is sealed. He bargains specifically and exclusively for the right to retain a portion of the demons, the spirits of the Nephilim. This is a critical legal distinction. The heavenly court treated the two groups as separate cases. The fallen angels, the original mutineers, were subject to immediate and total imprisonment. But the demons, their hybrid offspring, were subject to a different ruling, a negotiated settlement that allowed a tenth of them to remain on earth under Mastema's command. This proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that in the eyes of God and the heavenly government, these are two distinct classes of beings. They have different origins, they committed different crimes in different realms, and they were therefore subject to different sentences. The very structure of the post-flood judgment is a divine confirmation of the hierarchy of hell. This ancient distinction between the high-ranking, spiritual, fallen angels and the earth-bound, disembodied demons is not just a forgotten curiosity from the Book of Enoch. It is a crucial piece of strategic intelligence that illuminates the entire landscape of the New Testament. The writers of the Gospels and the Epistles were operating with this nuanced understanding, and once you know the difference, you begin to see it in the precision of their language. Consider the writings of the Apostle Paul. When he describes the grand cosmic scope of our spiritual battle in his letter to the Ephesians, he is incredibly specific. He states that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, the rulers of the darkness of this world, and spiritual wickedness in the heavenly places. This is the language of political and military hierarchy. He is describing the officer class, the high command of the enemy, the very same primordial, purely spiritual fallen angels who operate in the celestial realms, waging a strategic war against God's plan. He is not talking about the common, street-level spirits that possess individuals. But when we turn to the Gospels and witness the earthly ministry of Jesus, we see him engaging with a different class of enemy entirely. The hostile entities that he confronts on a daily basis are almost always identified as demons or unclean spirits, and their behavior is perfectly consistent with the profile of the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim. They are earthbound. They are desperate for a physical host, as seen in their frantic plea to be sent into a herd of swine. They are the agents of physical and mental torment, causing sickness, madness, and self-destruction. Jesus is not engaging in high-level strategic debates with cosmic rulers. He is performing battlefield medicine, liberating individual human beings from the parasitic guerrilla warfare of the demonic infantry. The New Testament, therefore, does not present a single monolithic enemy. It presents a two-front war. Paul describes the strategic battle against the fallen angelic high command in the heavenly places. The Gospels depict the tactical, ground-level battle against the demonic foot soldiers who torment humanity on earth. The distinction has been there all along, hidden in plain sight. The evidence is clear. The most ancient texts, and even a nuanced reading of the New Testament, present a clear and consistent distinction between the officer class of fallen angels and the infantry of demons. And so, we must now ask the critical question: why was this crucial piece of strategic intelligence, this detailed organizational chart of the enemy, so completely erased from mainstream theology? Why were these two distinct classes of beings merged into a single, blurry, and ultimately misleading figure? The primary motive, as is so often the case with the great redactions of history, was a desire for theological tidiness. The gatekeepers of the new institutional Christianity that emerged in the centuries after Christ were engaged in a project of simplification. They were trying to take a complex, messy, and profoundly Hebraic faith and transform it into a clean, rational, and easily defensible Greek philosophical system. And a complex, multi-layered demonology did not fit into this neat, tidy new box. A universe with multiple classes of hostile spiritual entities, each with a different origin story, different motivations, and different functions, is a complex and unsettling universe. It is a world that requires a high level of spiritual discernment to navigate. A simple, dualistic model of God versus the devil is far easier to teach, far easier to preach, and far easier to control. By consolidating all cosmic evil under the single monolithic figurehead of Satan, and by labeling all subordinate evil entities as demons or fallen angels interchangeably, the gatekeepers achieved a state of doctrinal simplicity. They created a single, easily identifiable enemy. It was a brilliant act of theological branding, but in their quest for a tidy narrative, they sacrificed a critical piece of battlefield intelligence. They gave us a simpler enemy, but they left us strategically blind to his true, complex, and hierarchical nature. The desire for theological tidiness was a powerful motive, but there was another, even deeper and more strategic reason for the deliberate merging of demons and fallen angels. By collapsing these two distinct categories into one, the gatekeepers were able to perform a masterful act of historical censorship. They were able to sever the direct and undeniable link between the demonic realm and the uncomfortable, terrifying, and profoundly problematic history of the Watchers and the Nephilim in Genesis chapter 6. Think of the strategic brilliance of this move. If demons are simply another name for the primordial fallen angels who rebelled with Lucifer before the creation of the world, then the entire bizarre and grotesque story of Genesis 6 becomes a strange and isolated anomaly. It can be spiritualized away, treated as a myth, an allegory, a strange footnote that has no direct bearing on the present reality of spiritual warfare. The story of the Watchers and their giant hybrid offspring can be safely locked away in the attic of obscure and irrelevant scripture. But if, as the ancient texts so clearly testify, demons are the literal disembodied spirits of the dead Nephilim, then the story of Genesis 6 is no longer an irrelevant footnote. It becomes the essential, foundational, and unavoidable origin story for every single demonic encounter described in the New Testament. It means that to understand the nature of the demons that Jesus cast out, you must first understand the sin of the angels who fathered them. The gatekeepers had to erase the distinction between demons and fallen angels because they wanted to erase the history of the Watchers. They wanted to disconnect the reality of demonic activity from its messy, genetic, and supernatural origins. By creating a single generic fallen angel category, they successfully defanged and dehistoricized the entire explosive narrative of Genesis 6. They hid the true identity of the infantry to cover up the war crimes of the officers who had created them. The final and cumulative effect of this long campaign of censorship was a profound transformation in the very genre of the story of evil. The gatekeepers of the new orthodoxy took what was originally a piece of detailed, strategic, military-style intelligence and successfully reduced it to a simple moral fable. They took an enemy organizational chart and turned it into a bedtime story about a singular boogeyman. The ancient, uncensored texts provided a detailed order of battle for the kingdom of darkness. They identified the high command, the primordial fallen angels operating in the heavenly realms. They identified the ground troops, the earthbound, disembodied spirits of the Nephilim. They revealed their different origins, their different motivations, and their different theaters of operation. This was not a fable, it was a field manual. It was a dossier on the enemy, designed to equip the people of God with the strategic knowledge needed to fight and win a multi-front, multi-dimensional war. But in their quest for a simpler, safer, and more controllable faith, the gatekeepers chose to classify this intelligence. They took the detailed dossier and replaced it with a wanted poster, one that featured a single, composite, and ultimately misleading image of a generic Satan. Instead of providing us with the strategic intelligence we needed to understand the complexity of the war, they gave us a simple moral fable about a singular villain. And in doing so, they left us not just ignorant, but vulnerable. A generation of soldiers sent into a complex battle with a map that has been deliberately and tragically simplified. To rediscover this forbidden hierarchy of hell is to reclaim a piece of strategic intelligence that has been lost for centuries. This knowledge is not just an academic curiosity. It has profound and practical implications for how we understand and engage in the spiritual battle. Knowing that we face two distinct classes of enemy with two distinct natures allows us to develop a far more sophisticated and effective approach to spiritual warfare. First, let us consider the fallen angels. These are the high command, the primordial, purely spiritual beings whose primary sin was political and theological rebellion. Their theater of operations is in the high places, the heavenly realms. Their primary strategy, therefore, is not the possession of individuals, but the corruption of systems. They are the architects of ideology, the whisperers behind thrones, the authors of the great philosophical and religious lies that deceive entire nations. They work through governments, through institutions, through cultural movements, and through the grand, sweeping narratives that shape history. To fight against them is to engage in a war of ideas, of truth against deception, a battle for the very soul of our civilizations. And then there are the demons, the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim. They are the infantry, the guerrilla fighters, whose primary motivation is not grand ideology, but a raw, parasitic hunger born of their own tragic and disembodied state. Their theater of operations is not the high places, but the ground level of human experience. Their primary strategy is not the corruption of systems, but the torment of individuals. They are the agents of addiction, of madness, of sickness, of inexplicable fear, and of the desperate driving desire to possess a physical body. To fight against them is to engage in a deeply personal, hands-on battle for the liberation of individual souls. To mistake one for the other is a critical strategic error. To try and fight a global ideology with a personal exorcism is to bring the wrong weapon to the fight. To try and counsel a person who is under direct demonic torment as if they are merely struggling with a bad idea is to fail to recognize the true nature of their affliction. Knowing the difference is the first step toward fighting with discernment. The restored, uncensored history of the enemy provides a direct and powerful answer to one of the most persistent and puzzling questions in all of demonology. Why are demons so obsessed with possessing physical bodies? Throughout the Gospels and in countless accounts of demonic activity throughout history, we see this same desperate, driving impulse. They seek to inhabit humans, and if they cannot inhabit a human, as in the case of the Gerasene demoniac, they will even plead to inhabit a herd of swine rather than be left disembodied. The traditional simplified model of demons as just another name for fallen angels offers no coherent explanation for this. Why would a purely spiritual being, a fallen angel from the heavenly realms, have any need or desire for a clumsy, mortal, flesh and blood vessel? The impulse makes no logical sense. But when we understand, as the Book of Enoch so clearly testifies, that demons are the disembodied spirits of the dead, hybrid Nephilim, their motivation becomes instantly and tragically clear. They are not purely spiritual beings. They are the ghosts of a race that was once physical. They remember what it was like to have a body, to have strength, to walk the earth, to eat, to drink, to exert their will upon the physical world. Their present disembodied state is a form of torment, a perpetual frustrating state of being untethered from the physical reality they were born into. Their desperate search for a body is, therefore, not a random act of malice. It is a parasitic hunger, an attempt to relive, even for a moment, the physical existence that was taken from them in the judgment of the flood. They do not just want to harm you, they want to be you. They want to use your hands, your voice, your appetites. They are spiritual squatters, desperate to find a physical house to inhabit, because they no longer have one of their own. This knowledge is not just a theological detail. It is a critical piece of strategic intelligence. It explains the enemy's deepest motivation and reveals the profoundly parasitic nature of all demonic oppression. With this uncensored intelligence in hand, we can now return to the gospel accounts of the ministry of Jesus and see his famous exorcisms in a completely new and far more profound light. These were not just random acts of healing or generic displays of power over a vague spiritual evil. They were specific, strategic, and legally significant acts of a king reclaiming his territory from an ancient and illegitimate occupying force. Every time Jesus confronted a demon, he was not just confronting a spiritual sickness, he was confronting a ghost of the pre-flood world. He was face to face with the lingering spiritual residue of the great angelic mutiny, the enduring legacy of the Nephilim. His exorcisms were not just acts of compassion, they were acts of eviction. He was serving a divine eviction notice upon the spiritual squatters who had been illegally occupying human bodies, the very temples that had been created in the image of God. Consider his confrontation with the demoniac in the country of the Gerasenes. The demon's name is Legion, for we are many. This is the language of an occupying army, and their desperate plea to be sent into the swine rather than into the abyss reveals their deep historical and theological knowledge. They know the fate of their angelic fathers, the Watchers, who were cast into the abyss, and they are terrified of suffering the same fate. Jesus' authority in these encounters is absolute. He does not negotiate. He does not struggle. He commands. As the rightful king, the perfect and uncorrupted Son of Man, he is exercising his legal authority to cleanse his kingdom of the last, defiant remnants of an ancient hybrid invasion. Each exorcism is a small, localized D-Day, a beachhead of divine order being re-established in a world that had been under enemy occupation for millennia. This is not just a story of healing, it is the story of a liberation. To understand the full strategic picture of the enemy's operations, we must now synthesize our knowledge of these two distinct classes of hostile entities and see them not as separate forces, but as a coordinated, hierarchical military structure. While the fallen angels and the demons have different origins and functions, the ancient texts make it clear that they are fighting on the same side, operating under a unified cosmic chain of command. The primordial, purely spiritual fallen angels, the original rebels from the courts of heaven, function as the high command, the officer class. As Paul describes them, they are the principalities and powers who occupy the strategic high ground of the heavenly realms. From this position, they orchestrate the grand, long-term campaigns against God's plan. They are the authors of the great deceptions, the architects of the ideologies and world systems that lead entire nations and civilizations astray. The demons, the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, function as the infantry, the ground troops. They are the earthbound agents who carry out the tactical street-level operations. They may not be the authors of the grand philosophical lies, but they are the ones who enforce them through individual torment, affliction, and possession. They are the ones who create the chaos, the fear, and the human misery that makes the grand deceptions of their masters seem plausible. The Book of Jubilees gives us a name for the one who likely sits at the top of this chain of command, the figure who acts as the bridge between the high command and the infantry, Prince Mastema. As the chief of the spirits, he is the general who directs the operations of the demonic ground forces, but he is also a celestial being who has access to the heavenly courts, as seen in his legal prosecution of Abraham. This is not a disorganized mob of evil spirits. It is a structured, coordinated, and intelligent army with generals in the heavens and foot soldiers on the earth, all working in concert to oppose the kingdom of God. And to fight them effectively, we must be able to discern which level of the enemy's command structure we are actually engaging with. This restored, uncensored intelligence about the enemy's true hierarchical nature is not just a fascinating piece of ancient lore. It is a direct and urgent summons to a more mature, more discerning, and more strategically effective form of spiritual warfare. For too long, a significant portion of the Church has operated with a one-size-fits-all approach to the spiritual battle, an approach born of the very theological simplification that we have been investigating. On one hand, there is a tendency to treat all spiritual problems as if they are the work of high-level strategic fallen angels. This can lead to a kind of detached, overly intellectualized faith, where we are constantly binding principalities in the abstract, while ignoring the very real, ground-level demonic torment that may be afflicting the people right in front of us. On the other hand, there is a tendency to see a low-level demon behind every bush, to treat every problem, from a common cold to a bad thought, as a target for a dramatic exorcism, while failing to recognize the larger, systemic, and ideological strongholds that the high command of the enemy has built in our cultures and institutions. A mature spiritual warfare requires discernment. It requires the wisdom to ask, am I dealing with the infantry or the officer class? Is this a ground-level, parasitic, demonic affliction that requires a direct, authoritative command of eviction in the name of Jesus? Or is this a high-level ideological deception, a stronghold of false reasoning that must be dismantled with the weapons of truth, of sound doctrine, and of patient, logical persuasion, as the Apostle Paul describes in 2 Corinthians? To use the wrong weapon against the wrong enemy is to fight ineffectively. You do not fight a tank with a rifle, and you do not fight a sniper with a sledgehammer. The knowledge of the enemy's hierarchy is not just for our information, it is for our effectiveness. It is a call to move beyond a simplistic, one-dimensional view of the spiritual battle and to become wise, discerning soldiers who know their enemy and know which weapons to use in which situation. The gatekeepers of the early church, in their quest for theological tidiness, may have successfully merged the identities of the fallen angels and the demons on the pages of their creeds and catechisms. They created a single, composite enemy for a simpler story. But their editorial decisions on earth had absolutely no effect on the spiritual reality in the heavens. The enemy was never actually merged. Despite 17 centuries of theological confusion, the two armies have remained distinct. The primordial, purely spiritual fallen angels have continued their strategic, high-level warfare from the heavenly realms, orchestrating the great ideological and political movements that shape the course of nations. And the earthbound, disembodied spirits of the Nephilim have continued their tactical, ground-level guerrilla war, tormenting, afflicting, and seeking to possess the bodies of individual human beings. The enemy's organizational chart was not rewritten just because our own theological manuals were. The truth that was suppressed did not cease to be the truth. It simply became a hidden truth. A piece of classified intelligence that the institutional church no longer possessed. And for centuries, the enemy has benefited enormously from our strategic blindness. He has waged a two-front war against an army that was largely taught to believe he only had one front. But that era of blindness is coming to an end. The re-emergence of the ancient, uncensored texts is a divine act of declassification, The original intelligence reports are being returned to us. We are, for the first time in generations, being given back the complete and accurate order of battle of the enemy. The choice before us now is whether we will continue to fight according to the simplified, redacted manuals of the past, or whether we will have the courage to embrace the more complex, more dangerous, and ultimately more accurate strategic reality that has now been revealed. The enemy on the page may have been merged, but the enemy in reality remains unmerged. While the fallen angels and the demons have different origins and different battlefield functions, the ancient texts are in perfect and sober agreement on one final point. They share the same ultimate destiny. The division in the enemy's ranks, the hierarchy that defines their operations, is a temporary, wartime structure. In the end, all rebellion will be brought before the same throne and will face the same final verdict. The Book of Enoch is clear that the Watchers, the high-ranking angelic officers who initiated the Second Great Mutiny, are being held in their chains of darkness for a specific purpose, to be brought forth for a final public sentencing on the great day of judgment. Their current imprisonment is not their final fate. It is merely their pre-trial confinement in a maximum security celestial prison. The New Testament confirms this future, unified judgment. The Book of Revelation describes a final climactic battle, after which the devil, the beast, and the false prophet are all cast into a lake of fire and sulfur. This is the ultimate and eternal destination for the high command of the kingdom of darkness. And Jesus himself, in the Gospel of Matthew, states that on the day of judgment, the wicked will be cast into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. This phrase, his angels, is a powerful and all-encompassing term. It does not make a distinction between the primordial rebels who fell with Lucifer and the later mutineers who followed Samyaza. It includes all of them, and by extension, it includes the demonic offspring of that second mutiny. While they may have different origins and different ranks, they are all part of the same rebellious kingdom, all fighting under the same banner of pride and hostility against the throne of God, and they will all share in the same final, irreversible defeat. The hierarchy of hell is a temporary structure, destined to be dismantled. The distinctions between the officer class and the infantry will be erased in the face of a single, unifying sentence. The complex organizational chart of the enemy will ultimately be replaced by a simple and eternal reality. A kingdom of light for those who chose loyalty, and a lake of fire for all who chose rebellion. The journey to uncover the true hierarchical nature of the enemy is a summons to move beyond the simplistic childhood image of a singular monolithic boogeyman. For too long, our understanding of evil has been shaped by a flattened, two-dimensional caricature, a single, all-purpose villain who is responsible for every form of temptation, deception, and destruction. This is an easy and convenient concept, but it is a profoundly inadequate one. It fails to capture the strategic complexity, the historical depth, and the multifaceted nature of the opposition we truly face. To embrace the uncensored truth is to embrace a more mature and sober-minded view. It is to recognize that we are not fighting against a single entity, but against a complex and ancient spiritual ecosystem of rebellion. There are different factions with different histories and different motivations. There is the high-level ideological warfare of the primordial fallen angels, the principalities and powers who seek to corrupt the very systems of our world. And there is the ground-level parasitic warfare of the demonic spirits of the Nephilim, who seek to torment and possess the bodies of individual human beings. This is not a less frightening picture. In many ways, it is a more frightening one. It is easier to fight against a single, identifiable boogeyman than it is to fight against a complex and often invisible network of hostile forces. But while it is more frightening, it is also more accurate. And in warfare, accuracy is everything. This knowledge calls us to a new level of spiritual discernment. It calls us to stop looking for a single, simple explanation for every manifestation of evil, and to begin asking the harder, more strategic questions. What is the nature of the specific opposition I am facing? Am I dealing with a high-level ideological stronghold that requires the weapons of truth and prayer? Or am I dealing with a direct, ground-level demonic affliction that requires the authority of the name of Jesus? To move beyond the boogeyman is to move from a faith of fear to a faith of strategy. And so, we have come to the end of our intelligence briefing. We began with a common and seemingly harmless confusion, the blurred line between demon and fallen angel. We followed that thread of confusion back through the centuries, to the councils and the gatekeepers who, in a quest for a simpler faith, deliberately merged these two distinct identities. We then unsealed the ancient, uncensored chronicles of Enoch and Jubilees, and in their pages we found the complete and terrifying order of battle for the kingdom of darkness. We have restored the distinction. We have identified the high command, the primordial, purely spiritual fallen angels, the strategists who wage a cosmic political war from the heavenly realms. We have identified the infantry, the tormented, disembodied, and earthbound spirits of the dead Nephilim, the guerrilla fighters, who wage a parasitic war for the bodies and souls of individual humans. We have understood their different origins, their different natures, and their different battlefield functions. We are no longer fighting in the dark. We are no longer confronting a vague, monolithic, and ill-defined enemy. The organizational chart of hell has been declassified. We now possess a more complete, more accurate, and more strategically useful understanding of the enemy than the Church has had access to for nearly 1700 years. This knowledge is not a curiosity, it is a weapon. It is the restoration of the strategic intelligence that is necessary to fight with wisdom, with discernment, and with the full assurance that we understand the nature of the enemy we have been called to defeat. For centuries, the enemy has benefited enormously from our strategic blindness. By allowing his forces to be consolidated under a single generic name, the gatekeepers of tradition inadvertently did him a great service. They hid his true hierarchical structure, they obscured his complex origins, and they blurred the lines between his different methods of attack. But today, that hidden truth has been unsealed. The unspoken hierarchy is no longer unspoken. We know now that there is a difference between the officers and the infantry. There are the political rebels of the primordial heavens, and there are the vengeful ghosts of a failed genetic war on Earth. They are not the same. And knowing this is the first and most critical step in moving from a defensive faith to an offensive one. This is not just theology, it is battlefield intelligence. And it has been returned to us in this generation for a reason. As the cosmic conflict accelerates toward its final conclusion, we are being rearmed with the ancient knowledge that was suppressed. We are being called to fight with a new level of wisdom and discernment. And so the final question is this: knowing now that there is a clear hierarchy in the enemy's forces, between the commanding fallen angels and the infantry of demons. How does this change the way you understand the nature of the spiritual battles in your own life and in the world around you? Let us know in the comments below.